Welcome to the Micromobility Report podcast, where we'll discuss how we can all go further with less. I'm your co-host, Phil Latz, publisher of the Micromobility Report.
And I'm Irene McAleese, co-founder of C-Sense.
Today we'll be talking with Melinda Hanson, one of the key influencers for micromobility in New York City. She's the founder of Brightside Consulting and the co-founder of the Equitable Commute Project.
So, Melinda, thank you so much for coming on the Micromobility Report podcast. So I first met you a few years ago, but our listeners may or may not be aware of your amazing career that you've had. I wondered if you could just step us through, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to get to what you're working on today.
Sure, yeah. Actually, we met over whiskey at Velo City, right? in Rio, Brazil.
Keep it real, yes.
Too much information,
Long
Irene is saying.
Yeah, so I've been working at the intersection of climate and transportation pretty much my whole career, starting at a foundation called the Climate Works Foundation, which I was a founding staff member back in 2007. And from there really discovered a love for urban transportation issues, among all of the many climate issues that one could be focused on. After philanthropy, I went into graduate school to study urban planning. And from there went on to be an urban planner and urban designer and work on a number of large-scale infrastructure projects covering public transportation and bicycle and pedestrian projects in Asia and Africa, and a little bit in the US. From there, I made the jump to the private sector, where I became the head of sustainability at Bird, the electric scooter company that started it all, and is still hanging on. And after leaving Bird around the pandemic, I started my own consulting firm, first called Electric Avenue, which was with some partners, and now have since spun off to my very own consulting firm called Brightside. So Brightside provides public affairs, strategy, and research support to accelerate the work of climate tech companies as well as nonprofits. I also do a fair amount of advising for government organizations, mostly in the micromobility space, but also increasingly in other climate arenas like circularity, battery management, things like that.
Mm-hmm. And so what prompted you to leave the safe salary of working for larger organizations to go and set up your own business in what is really, I suppose, quite a tough market?
Yeah, well, it was actually not a choice. At first, I was part of the layoffs at the peak COVID time. The e-scooter industry had a lot of VC funding, and so in March of 2020, I was part of some layoffs with that. And there weren't a lot of options out there, but I knew that a lot of the skills that I had and had contributed to Bird, as well as cities and infrastructure projects in the past, could be helpful for a number of groups that are percolating up in the growing sustainable mobility space. So yeah, just went for it, and it turned out to be a real blessing because it turns out it's a very good fit for me, and I love the opportunity to partner with fast growth startups, which can be chaotic but have so much energy and so much enthusiasm and optimism for solving climate and other major problems. As well as working with bleeding hearts at nonprofits, and of course advising government. So being a consultant and having my own practice in particular allows me to really work on whatever areas of interest I have.
Yeah, that's great. There's so much variety in what you're doing now, and I guess that must be very stimulating. So how would you split your time through the charitable side of what you do, and then also the sort of the government advisory or the consultancy work? What would that split kind of look like for you, or does that change all the time?
It changes a lot. It really depends on the month. Right now, a lot of my work with nonprofit organizations is focused on the Equitable Commute Project, which is a coalition organization that I founded or co-founded in 2020. Trying to build more of a movement to advocate for sensible e-bike, e-scooter, other micromobility devices or their policy. There wasn't really like a organization that was strictly focused on those issues at the time. And in New York, there were a lot of policy proposals being presented that were misguided. It's a nice way of putting it. So we wanted to build a coalition to to bring some rigor and some vision and solutions to the table in order to really capture the greatest benefits that micromobility can provide.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I want to hear a little bit more about those exciting projects in a moment.
Yeah, we'll definitely come
Yeah.
back to that
Yeah.
equitable commute project, but I just want to hop in the helicopter and go to a bigger picture for a moment. From all your wide experience across multiple organisations, if you had to make a list of the top 3 things that would make a difference in growing micromobility in a city, what would they be?
Ooh, that's a hard one. The first is I would completely change the way that infrastructure is approved and constructed in cities. The majority of government activities that contribute to improving safety of its citizens aren't required to go through such a political process and have fights and approvals over every 100 feet of bike lane infrastructure. Just as for example, if there's a lead pipe that needs to be fixed, or a electric hazard that needs to be improved, we don't ask every neighbor across an entire community whether or not that should be done. It is the government's role to implement safety infrastructure. So first is, I think that there should be consultation with the community, but not the ability to veto, especially bicycle infrastructure projects that we currently have. It's just very inefficient and results in a lot of fragmented infrastructure projects and a lot of time spent engaging folks who, quite frankly, just aren't experts, aren't safety experts in the space. So that would be the number one thing that I would change. The number 2 thing, right now there's a really big issue with battery fires in New York City. There were more than 200 structural fires from micromobility batteries last year, and that's from a range of different products. And I think every city across the globe needs to move quickly to start regulating and requiring standardization for any batteries that are coming into or being sold. New York has adopted UL 2849 standards, which just mean that the battery, the product, the motor, the whole system has been tested for fire safety and significantly increases safety. The fact that hasn't been addressed is creating a whole range of additional problems and pushback and perception that this is just inherently a dangerous mode, not just on the streets, but also in apartments. So being proactive in cities across the globe, even where it's not currently a problem, to make sure that we have standardization and high quality vehicles is really important. The third is, I guess I was really inspired. I did a study tour in Copenhagen on bicycle infrastructure when I was working more on directly urban planning projects. And one of the things that stuck out to me the most there was how much biking is part of culture from a very young age. We had this delightful experience where we got to watch these preschoolers play cycle games. And when the teachers open the door, the whole crew of them run out. They're so excited. They have their little push cycles that they're going around and collecting rings off the floor and playing with one another. And just seeing how much that becomes a part of their independence and their growth and their interaction, and just like their joy in their day was so inspiring. And I would love to see so much more of that embracing of cycling. And practical cycling skills as well, right? Like they're games, but they were actually learning some functional skills, passing that or really integrating that into like education really throughout people's lives.
Yeah.
Well, that's a excellent, well considered off the bat answer with no forewarning and 3 great ideas. Just want to come back to clarify batteries 200 fires last year. Now, is that including power drills and other electrically powered devices, or is that just your micromobility e-bikes, e-scooters and so on?
It's just micromobility devices, so it's e-bikes, e-scooters, e-mopeds, hoverboards, kind of the range of things that are on wheels.
And that's just New York City you're talking
just
about?
New York City. Yeah, there were, I believe it was 17 deaths even from it in New York City. I mean, we're a large city. It's a city of 8.5 million, but it's a really acute problem here. And a lot of it is focused in lower income communities. The majority of fires are in the homes of people who rely on micromobility to make a living, so working cyclists. And so, the problem is you start with these low quality, non-standardized batteries and systems, then you get a little damage in there, then you have some electric problem in your old building, and it's just a cause for, it's tragic. And there's been a lot of unnecessary deaths and injuries and disruptions to people's lives.
I think most people wouldn't realise the scale of just how many delivery riders there are in New York City. I've seen some numbers, but what's your number that you use as the total number of delivery riders, be they full-time, part-time, whatever?
The most common number you see is 65,000, although I've seen estimates from people who work in the business of it being as high as 100,000. Now that I've done some work with delivery workers as part of the Equitable Commute Project, I think it's a really hard number to put your finger on because it's a constantly moving figure. Some people are full-time delivery workers and this is what they plan to do for their foreseeable future. Others do it to supplement other kind of seasonal jobs. Others do it part-time. There's just like such a range of folks who are involved in the space. So at any one time, I imagine that number could be quite different, but it's definitely somewhere above 65,000.
Which is a lot. It's a football
lot.
stadium full of delivery riders.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, you're in New York City, which is a leader in many ways in the US when it comes to micromobility. What are some of the big issues playing out in New York City right now?
So in addition to the fires, so in response to the fires, the city passed a law requiring all e-bikes sold in the city to be UL 2849, which was a great step and a necessary one. But it had the unforeseen consequence of pushing a lot of delivery workers to gas-powered mopeds because mopeds are cheaper and they don't have to worry about where to charge them and they don't have to worry about battery fires. So now suddenly we have this massive proliferation of mopeds that are required to be licensed, like you have to have a license plate on them. They have to be registered with the state DMV, and the riders of them, depending on what class of vehicle, have to have at least a driver's license, if not a special motorcycle license. And the majority, at least anecdotally, when you look around, of the mopeds that are on the streets these days, do not have license plates, and many of the folks who are riding them do not appear to have the correct driver's license. So this is creating a lot of chaos on our streets right now. Folks who used to ride bikes are now riding the mopeds as if they were riding bikes. They're riding on sidewalks. They're riding the wrong way on traffic. And it's really creating a lot more hazards on our streetscape. Like, this is a major pedestrian city, and pedestrians, I think rightly so, feel more endangered by the mopeds. So that's a really huge issue that's playing out, and trying to figure out what the right response is, something that, is considerate of not wanting to push the police force on a lot of folks who are riding the mopeds, who tend to be immigrants, Black and brown community members, but also needing to get some order to the space. So the city's really struggling with how to enforce things and do it equitably.
So just to paint a clearer picture, particularly for us Aussies down under, mopeds is not a word we use a heck of a lot here. Would it be something as large as a Vespa step-through scooter and as fast as that we're talking, or something smaller, and does it have pedals or just foot pegs?
Yeah, the Vespa example is exactly the one I always point to. It's something that looks like a Vespa and no pedals, just the foot base.
So capable of going quite a high speed.
Yeah, 35 to 55, I think, in most cases.
In miles per hour, you're talking there.
Miles per hour, yep.
So like 60 to 80 kilometres an hour. So way too big, fast and powerful to be on a footpath.
Yeah, or on bike lanes. Yeah, and it's, even as someone who's a huge advocate and is constantly defending, people's behavior in this space, it's very hard to defend. I have a toddler who I push around in a stroller, and I have folks on mopeds trying to compete with me to get on top of to get, through the curb cut onto the sidewalk. So there's just a lot of issue with antisocial riding behavior.
Mm-hmm. And what about the congestion charge that has been in the headlines? What's your take on that? And where do you think it will land? Do you think it's dead and buried, or do you think it will come back? And maybe perhaps you can give a bit of context for people that don't follow New York as closely as I do and might not have heard of what the heck am I talking about?
Yeah, it is truly heartbreaking, I have to say. So congestion charging is the idea of adding tolls to specific zones, and in New York City it was planned in Manhattan below 60th Street, so that's almost half of Manhattan and the busiest area of Manhattan. And the idea was that there would be tolls, so if you entered the central business district, entered the congestion charging zone, you would pay a toll just like you would to cross a bridge, or like it is in so many places. The toll varied based on the vehicle type and also the time of day, going as high as $15 to enter the zone for a private vehicle, and upwards of $20 for trucks. Of course, congestion charging has been implemented in London, in Singapore, and in Stockholm, several other cities across the world, and it's always met with a lot of resistance when it comes into place, but then pretty much loved by a majority of people once it's actually there. The idea is to just get people to pay their fair share, to internalize a lot of the externalities associated with driving. So the city had kicked it around as a policy option for decades, really starting with the Bloomberg administration, and it didn't go anywhere. There was finally a law that was passed to call for congestion charging during 2019, when there was a major failure across our subway system. We've had a hard time raising enough money or putting enough government funds towards the subway system in New York City to keep pace with the various upgrades that need to happen. Haven't been able to have money to extend service, haven't had money to add elevators into stations, and so for decades, the only funding available has really just been for like absolutely mission critical repairs. So the idea was that passing congestion charging created a reliable revenue source for the MTA to fund repairs and upgrades and modernization, really, of a more than 100-year-old system. That was passed in 2019. A ton of money, a ton of work was put into working toward the implementation. There were multiple lawsuits against people who opposed it. There were 1,000-page studies that were done on the environmental impact to make sure that traffic diverted wasn't somehow creating more emissions. And finally, we got to the place where we had a date of implementation, which was June 30th. And about 3 weeks before the implementation date, to everybody's surprise, our Governor Kathy Hochul, came out and said she was putting an indefinite pause on congestion charging, which, by the way, is law. So it's really not clear that she's even allowed to do such things. But there actually just today there was news coming out that the city's comptroller is planning a series of lawsuits to push back and require implementation of congestion charging. So I think that it's really unfortunate that a democratic process was pretty arbitrarily squashed due to political reasons, according to many people. But that you go through all of that, you have all of the electeds, all of the constituents on board, and then the governor, says that she had some conversations in a diner and decided to just not implement this necessary system. Doesn't really feel like much of a democracy when you look at that.
Wow.
But hopefully these lawsuits will actually show that she either doesn't have the authority to just decide to not implement a law that is a law, or that by not doing this, she's violating the Americans with Disabilities Act or other climate laws that have been adopted. So the first lawsuit, I think, was just filed this week even, and there's several others that are planned. So I remain hopeful and very frustrated that this is where we are right now.
Wow, that's certainly a lot going on. And there was also a new package of 8 bills that were passed, I read, as well this week, looking at the retailers being banned from selling uncertified batteries, or there were a whole range of different things in that bill, so reporting crashes and things like that. Is that going to be helpful, do you think, those measures?
Yeah, so those were all at the state level. So the one I mentioned before, requiring UL 2849 certification for e-bikes sold in New York, that was a city level one.
Okay.
So the state essentially replicated that, and I think added a European standard that is allowed as well.
Okay.
There were a series of bills. So that was one, basically requiring at the state level that there's fire safety certification. There was also a bill that was focused on requiring registration and licensing at the point of sale for all mopeds. And so trying to get to that issue that I mentioned before about this proliferation of uncertified and unregistered vehicles. And then there were a few others in there. I know there was one calling on the state to administer a battery trade-in program to try and get unsafe batteries off the streets. And then a few others related to fire safety and other education campaigns.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, actually, just on that, tell us a little bit more about that very exciting project that you've been doing with the Equitable Commute Project, because I did, when I was in New York last, I did meet you and heard a bit about it, and I just thought it was absolutely brilliant, and that was really one of the main reasons I wanted to get you on to this, because I think more people need to know about it. It's just amazing. So tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, the ECP was formed in 2020 with the goal of trying to figure out how to support frontline workers to access affordable, high-quality e-bikes and advocate for sensible policy. We when the fire started, there was a ban proposed, basically that would not allow e-bikes to be stored in city-owned buildings, including city affordable housing buildings. And that just struck us as a little bit too draconian and not necessary given what we knew about what was happening. So we were pushing back against that ban and asking for there to be a more precise intervention, including, outdoor charging, requiring standardization and such. And while we were yapping about that, we were approached by some delivery apps that said, we were saying that needed to happen, and that in order for, that we should not ban the bikes. Instead, we should be pushing for incentive programs that provide discounted pricing for higher quality bikes, so that lower income New Yorkers, who tend to be the ones acquiring these more dangerous vehicles, can actually afford to get a fire safe bike. And so we were advocating for that, and were approached by some delivery apps who said, why don't you guys administer a program like that? And so we've been doing that for about a year now, where delivery workers can apply for the program. If they're approved, they can exchange their uncertified bike for discounted pricing on a UL 2849 certified bike. So we to date have done about 160 bikes, and plan to keep it going at least for a little bit longer. It was never our intention to run a program at scale for this. Like, you would need an awful lot of money to replace those tens of thousands of potentially hazardous e-bikes, and some big infrastructure. But essentially, we just wanted to work out the contours and show how it could actually work. and hopefully, push for there to be collective action between the government and the private sector and the nonprofit sector to administer a large-scale program like this.
So shouldn't Uber and DoorDash be legally required to provide their delivery riders with safe certified bikes, and shouldn't they be forced to employ riders and give them full legal equipment from lights to helmets to everything else they need, training, rather than being allowed to call them independent contractors and leave them out to dry?
I mean, that gets into the labor issues, of which there are many that you just listed here. I mean, we are trying to be productive and focus on the micromobility space and how do we advance solutions for micromobility. So we're not playing too much in the labor requirement space. There are bills that have been proposed that would do just that, that would require these companies to provide the vehicles for their workers. I think part of the challenge is that it is such a transient workforce. So in New York, at least, and for many, for some at least, it's a lot of new immigrants who may or may not have the various registrations and forms and residency that they need in order to have more formal employment. So for some, it is an entry point to actually making money where that would be harder for them to find jobs otherwise. But I think it's a really complicated topic. I think that the apps certainly do have should be expected to provide some amount of funding toward the vehicles, which is what they're doing right now with this program, by helping us to subsidize the purchase of new vehicles. And I think our recommendation as the ECP would be that there is a fee on top of deliveries that goes to a fund that would allow workers to actually access their own bikes. Because another part of this issue is that a lot of workers who have their bikes use it for purposes beyond just delivery work. They use it actually to get around the city. So complicated topic. They certainly have some role to play in this, and definitely a larger one than they're currently playing.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed following, your socials and seeing the happy faces of the delivery riders that are getting their bikes, and it certainly seems to be a program that's created a lot of buzz, and hopefully, as you say, it's going to seed that idea and help things grow and transform. Hey, listen, we also checked out there was a guest spot that you did on the Brian Lehrer, how do I pronounce
Brian Lehrer, yep.
Lehrer show, which is NYC Public Radio. It's an interesting discussion, and I picked up that there was, some of the talkback calls that were coming in that you fielded very well, I thought, but there was sort of a tone of, some aggravation that people were talking about, this sort of perception of the speeding of the delivery riders, just transport chaos generally in the streets. So how do you think, what's the best way to resolve that tension or the issues? Obviously it's a good thing to have more bikes and micromobility on streets, but I guess it's balancing that argument or the perception that there is a chaos that's being created. What are your thoughts on that? And for this audience, would you like to just expand on that a little?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest issues is that the proliferation of all types of vehicles on New York City streets, especially since the pandemic, has been really, really fast. And that includes e-bikes, it includes mopeds, it includes a range of micromobility devices, but it also includes delivery trucks. Deliveries have skyrocketed since the pandemic in New York City. So, it's like common to see an Amazon truck on like every other block around the city. There's also been an increase in car ridership as people, were scared of the subway during the pandemic and switched to cars and have continued to take cars. So at the same time this influx of micromobility has happened, there's also been an influx of other vehicles. And so the traffic congestion is bad in many places, and the competition for road space is really high. So but I think because the mopeds and the e-bikes are the new guy in town, in that a lot of people weren't so used to seeing them. They've kind of gotten used to all of the annoyances and chaos that cars bring. But this is something new. So I think that plays a really big role in it. I think people are sort of unfairly demonizing the micromobility in a lot of ways as like the root of the problem. You know, there's traffic congestion and people insist it's because there's a bike lane, which is, you know, just proven to be ridiculous time and time again. But yeah, it's I think it's a lot of it has to do with infrastructure and not proper infrastructure. Now that's not to fully excuse the way that people are riding. As I mentioned before, the mopeds and some of the e-bike riders are riding very aggressively. I think in most cases that's a response to just feeling this like stress and pressure on streets, and, you know, feeling like you're trying to make decisions that feel like the most rational decision for you, which sometimes involves getting up on a sidewalk. So the first thing I think would be most helpful is just getting the infrastructure right, doing things to encourage people to take more efficient modes, since of course you can fit about 10 bikes in the space of one car. And so, you know, doing many of the things that congestion charging was intended to do, and unfortunately is currently paused at. But infrastructure is huge. Training is huge. I think increasingly tech is going to play a role in managing transportation of all kinds, you know, things like speed limiters, geofencing on certain zones. I think we'll see a lot more of that in the coming decades, and hopefully that'll quell a lot of this chaos that people are feeling.
Yeah, perfect.
I'm mindful of time, and we've just got 2 more questions, if that's okay, Melinda.
Sure.
And one from me is just, what do you see happening in micromobility in the future? How optimistic are you, and what do you think the main changes to our cities, globally if you like, would be over the coming years?
I'm very optimistic about the future of micromobility. So as I've worked in the climate and transportation space, as I mentioned, my whole career, which is about 17 years now, I've never seen a more promising solution. You know, micromobility gives people the autonomy of the car with an unbelievable amount of affordability and efficiency and reliability. And the majority of people, when they're looking to make a transportation trip, are looking at those things. They want something that's reliable, that's fast, and that's not too expensive. So I think the more that we see cities following in the footsteps of like what Paris has done, for example, over the past 5 to 10 years, massively investing in bicycle infrastructure, at the same time restricting cars in particularly dense zones, and putting just more incentives for people to choose more efficient modes, I think we'll see a lot more uptake. The other thing that excites me a lot about micromobility is all of the different vehicle types. You know, right now we're still pretty focused on the 2-wheeled, open exposure, like bikes or bike adjacent modes, but of course there's new models coming out like the Twizy, which is, you know, a small little, I think it does have 4 wheels, but it's barely larger than the profile of a bicycle, but is an enclosed vehicle. And I think, you know, in cities, that's such a much more sensible bike or vehicle to use in a city. So hopefully we'll see an increase in vehicle types like that. The other thing I think is really exciting is you're seeing a lot more transition for freight and commercial vehicles over to micromobility. In New York City, that's mostly cargo bikes, trikes, and e-quads, and the city's really enthusiastic about it, and you do not have the same political pushback for those vehicles and for commercial uses as you do for private uses. So those things keep me very optimistic.
That is a great summary, and certainly very inspiring. I love all of those points. Melinda, is there anything else that, you know, we've asked you lots of questions, some of them without any notice at all, and you've been great at answering, but I think, is there anything that you want to come back and, you know, share back with our audience that we've maybe not covered today?
I just think that this is the most promising, equitable climate solution that I have seen. Micromobility, you know, provides a way for people to get around cities. It increases joy in their lives. It's affordable for people who don't have money to purchase and manage a car. And it could be something that not only reduces carbon emissions, but also makes for better and more joyful cities. So I just think that I would love to see people taking it more seriously. Traveling to places like Paris or London, where cycling has massively increased. If you haven't seen that yet, I think once you see it with your own eyes and see how these modern developed societies are incorporating micromobility more deeply into their transportation infrastructure, it is just life and mind changing. And that is a vision that could improve so many of the things that are wrong with our society today. And we all have to work toward it. And I think we'll all be better for it.
Yeah.
Well, Melinda Hanson, you've been a stunningly articulate guest, and thanks for coming on the Micromobility Report podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to see you guys.
Well, Irene, what an amazing articulate advocate Melinda is. That was super impressive, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I knew she would be great. I've known Melinda for a number of years, and I've just been so impressed at her breadth of knowledge because she's worked in the advocacy background, policy, worked in the micromobility industry, Bird. She's really broad range of perspectives and so articulate. I think she's amazing, and I'm really glad she was able to come on the podcast with us.
Yeah, it's really encouraging. It gives us hope when there's people like that, if you like, in our corner, if you want to be parochial, but people who are advocating for good things. So now we'll roll on to a little section we're going to have to wrap up every podcast that we started last month, and it's called What's Up. And it's just a chance for you and I to say what we're doing, what's coming up, what's on our mind. So Irene, what's up?
What's up? Well, I think since the last podcast, both of us have done a bit of travel. For me, it was off to Velo City. I wasn't going to go actually this year because of my move to Australia. I just thought I wasn't going to be able to squeeze it in, but then the pull became too strong. And as I started seeing all of the posts about Velo City this year, and especially as it was held in Ghent, such a beautiful city, I thought I have to go. So, and I'm so glad I did. It was just really good on a personal level just to connect with lots of people. I've been going to Velo City for a number of years now, so there is a community of people there, and I guess the thing is that it's so energizing to be amongst that. So the networking is really good, and coming away with this sort of perspective that you're not the only one in this, and there's lots of other people advocating, as you said, for good things. And so I think Velo City is fantastic for that. But aside from that, the city of Ghent itself was just so impressive, to see what they've done with the circulation plan there, how they've taken the traffic out of the city, essentially created much more space for people just to walk and cycle around the city. It's noticeably quieter, and the interesting thing is that they haven't needed to invest, so much in dedicated cycle lanes, just because you can pretty much cycle anywhere. So it's really interesting to see that in practice, and I think a model that a lot of cities could move towards. And then just also, there's some great speakers as well at Velo City. So you had Jeanette City-Khan opening, and there were, I think, interesting themes. A lot of it was about handling that sort of bike lash, the commute, how to position how to manage that pushback. As I think as Jeanette City-Khan said, when you change the status quo, when you push the status quo, it's going to push back at you. So how do you manage that, the storytelling and using data and all of these things to be able to generate change in the city? So super conference. I'm really happy that I went. And then now next steps for me is I'm going to be heading to the ITS Australia Summit in August. I'm sure it's going to be a completely different vibe, but I'm keen to make sure that cycling is in the mix in the discussions for ITS intelligent transport, because there's not enough cycling on the agenda typically in those type of conferences. So sometimes it's good to come out of your echo chamber and go into a space where it's not You know, Velocity is great because we're all singing the same hymn sheet. ITS world, not so much. So it is sometimes good to step out of that and make sure that our voice is heard elsewhere.
Absolutely, yeah. You're in the big end of town in Australia of ITS. I went last year down in Melbourne. But what you say about quietness too in Ghent, you notice that if you go to Amsterdam, it's just so quiet. The streets are so quiet,
Yeah.
and that's just normal.
Funny thing I heard was someone mentioned that they could hear the birds chirping as they were riding along, and they were saying maybe one of the measures of a successful city should be, you know, what's the chirpometer level in the city. Then I reflected, I'm not sure how that will work in Australia because we've got such noisy birds here. The cockatoos would be screeching and sending it off on a different, or the levels crazy. But birdometer, chirpometer was a good takeaway.
That's very good.
Kent.
So my what's up would be also, like you said, I've been lucky enough to be travelling, had 3.5 weeks, and spent a bit of time in 4 cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, and Singapore. So earlier this year I went to Taipei for the Taipei Cycle Show, and I did a story in Micromobility Report called Active Transportation Lessons from Taipei for Australia. So I went to, and that was very well received, got some good comments and good readership. So I went to London with the intention of taking photos and studying it to do a similar story, which I'll be doing in a future edition, Active Transport Lessons for Australia from London. And I was lucky enough to go to the control room of Transport for London and see both their motor vehicle control space and their London Underground control centre, which was a great privilege and very interesting. Wasn't allowed to take photos, unfortunately. It's a high security type operation, as you would expect. But did a lot of bike riding around London, mainly on Lime bikes, a little bit on the Santander docked bike share bikes, but really Lime seems to have the market share. But my goodness, a lot of those bikes were grubby and damaged. They really get a battering, and they really don't spend enough on maintenance. One time I had to try about 4 different bikes before I got one that was suitably rideable. But I did a lot of hours of riding. We're staying in Canary Wharf, and the first exploratory ride of my daily rides, stayed there a week. Into the centre of London, I was expecting a lot of traffic and so on, but it turns out that Cycle Superhighway 3 goes right from the centre of London out to Canary Wharf, and literally only have a few sets of traffic lights, and it's pretty much separated cycleway the whole way. And the famous embankment cycleway, which starts at the Parliament House, Westminster, and goes pretty much all the way down past the front of the city on the River Thames. Really is. It's smooth, it's wide, it's incredibly heavily used.
Beautiful.
It's really something to experience. But then on to Paris, and if London exceeded my expectations, then Paris further exceeded my higher expectations, because of course we've all been hearing a lot about Paris. Well, anyone who follows the micromobility space has been hearing a lot about Paris and Mayor Anne Hidalgo and what's been happening over the last 7 or 8 years. But I think the wider world will hear a lot about that over the next few weeks as the Paris Olympics plays out. You can imagine all those American anchor commentators saying, "Whoa, what's going on here?" and all these bicycles everywhere.
Yeah.
But it really was remarkable. There's some incredible work done. Not perfect, still delivery vehicles parked in bike lanes, etc. But just the volume of people riding and the range of ages, types of bikes, just the range of humanity riding and the sheer volume in a city. You know, I was a racing cyclist. I lived in Paris for a season in 1983 and raced for a team based in France. And I can tell you there was no cycling infrastructure back when, apart from the Vincennes Park, where there was a triangular thing, a bit like Centennial Park in Sydney, more like a recreational training loop. That was the only infrastructure in Paris that I was aware of in that season that I was there. So I've been back since, but it's really come on incredibly in the last few years. And then on to Frankfurt for the Eurobike show, world's biggest bike show. Frankfurt, to be honest, is quite a grubby city. There's a lot of people smoke, a lot of people vaping. There's a lot of rubbish on the ground. I'm sure the Frankfurt Tourist Department would be horrified by what I'm saying, but that's the reality that hits you when you get out of the main train station there. Incredible bike show, and a huge bike show, 150,000 square metres of gross exhibit space, 1,900 exhibitors, about 70,000 public and trade visitors from around the world. So a massive, massive show, and amazing tech coming, amazing levels of investment in cycling, especially e-bikes, motors, drive systems, AI, tech. But Frankfurt itself, yes, it's better than any Australian city in terms of its bike lanes and transport infrastructure, but it's not as good as Paris. It's probably on a par with London in many ways. And then lastly, a day in Singapore, which I've read is doing a lot of stuff with cycling, and it may be, but it's still got a lot of straight, wide 4, 5, 6 lane roads, which allow for very high speed driving. Mind you, it's the first city in the world that introduced congestion charging back in the 1970s. And they also have a tax, a very steep tax. I believe currently it sits at about $70,000. Basically, it's a market-driven thing where if you want to buy a car, you first have to buy the license to own a car, the right to own a car. And I believe that license currently will cost you about $70,000 or so before you buy the car. So it's a way of capping the number of cars in the city. And certainly Singapore's clean, on-time, clean public transport system and so on. So it's not all bad by any means in Singapore. And I did see some cycling, but just nowhere near as much as London, Paris or Frankfurt.
Yeah.
So that was my trip in a nutshell. Anything that you would like to say before we wrap up the episode?
Well, yeah, just a couple of reflections on your trip actually there. Firstly, it's great that you got to see Paris, because that's what Melinda was saying, wasn't it, in her wrap up, that she wants, if only more people could see that. And it is hopeful to see, what the Olympics is going to bring, those more eyes on this city, looking at that transformation. Gives me some hope for Brisbane, because the Olympics are going to be held in Brisbane in 2032. So I, sincerely hope that Brisbane can seize the mantle in that way and use it as an opportunity to make that transition. There'll
be a big delegate from Brisbane delegation going to Paris. So they'll see, the mayor, etc., I believe. So they'll see it all firsthand. They'll experience it. And 8 years, they've got time to do something about it. So let's hope it does have an impact.
I mean, London has certainly changed massively from when Phil and I lived there. And Singapore as well. Phil and I also lived in Singapore for a couple of years. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but that's actually where the idea of C-Sense came up, because Philip had been riding as a commuter in London, and then we moved to Singapore, and it was actually the difference in Singapore was this sort of he felt much more unsafe. So the cars will definitely come closer to you. There's a culture there of this kiasu thing of let me first, so they'll quite happily cut in on you a lot closer and stuff. So that's where we actually got the idea for C-Sense to sort of help.
Well, I think as a matter of fact, I think you mentioned that in the first micromobility podcast when I interviewed yourself with Philip.
Okay.
I think Singapore came up.
Yeah.
So
there you go.
On that note, I think we probably should wrap up. So I'd like to say to everyone, thanks for listening. We're planning to do a Micromobility Report podcast once a month. And if you want to find out more, visit the podcast page at micromobilityreport.com.au. And you can also subscribe so you don't miss a future podcast. And until then, keep riding.